Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Want to welcome to the program Tariq Habash. He is a former senior official at the Department of Education under President Biden. Now founder and director of the organization A New Policy with Josh Paul. Tariq, welcome to the program. You were a former senior official at the Department of Education, but not because Kamala Harris lost the election and Donald Trump came in. You were former while Joe Biden was still president. Tell us why.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Sam. And that's exactly right. I was at the Department of Education. I was a political appointee, and I was there from the very beginning of the administration, working on federal policy related to racial equity, to higher education, to student debt. And I left in January of 2024 because of the president's policies towards Palestinians in Gaza. As a Palestinian American myself, I felt very deeply the connection with what was happening and how our policies were not only bad for Palestinians in the region, but bad for Americans and bad for American policy. And despite my efforts to communicate that to the White House, through the secretary himself even, it was very clear that the administration had really no willingness to change on those policies. And the reality was there was a political barrier there. There was a political unwillingness to recognize not just the humanity of Palestinians, but what we were doing as being just outside of, American interests and American values. And when, Josh and I started talking about what we were experiencing, him at the State Department, me at Education, it was very clear the political barriers were the fundamental problem. And this is something that spans beyond partisan issues. This is an issue, unfortunately, that Democrats and Republicans have really been poor on for a long time. And I think we recognized in that moment that we needed to build an organization to address the political realities, that we needed American policy to reflect the interests of everyday Americans. And that means not sending billions of dollars of weapons to kill Palestinian children on the other side of the world when, people are starving here at home, when people are suffering from job loss and inflation and housing issues here at home. I think that message was partially communicated through the election, but I think even now we're still seeing a disconnect between the Democratic Party and its base, between the Republican Party and its voters. I think there are millions of Americans that don't feel like they have a political home. And so we wanted to create a new policy to do just that, to build on this movement that we've been seeing for over a year across the country, that is responsive to those facts and realities for everyday Americans.
Yeah, I want to, I think just add to what you said that I don't know that the entirety of Harris's loss is a function of that policy, but it certainly, undoubtedly, was a major contributing factor. And recent polling, this is what is fascinating. Donald Trump is not going to be punished by large parts of the Republican Party for his policies towards Gaza and the Palestinians, and the idea that we'll level the place and just put up hotels, and Palestinians will find some other place to live, wherever it is he thinks that they should go. The Republican Party it's not inconsistent with their worldview. Recent polling, I think it was Gallup, came out and showed that really a large majority of Democrats now are of the mind that we need to change our policy towards Israel and the Palestinian people. In fact, they're more sympathetic with the Palestinians than they are with the Israelis. And it has made, I think there was always a slight sort of like tension between certainly the Democratic base and where Democratic politicians were with in terms of Israel and Gaza. Although I have to say Biden went much further than I think that any other Democrat I've seen in allowing Israel free hand. But they're really out of sync now, and it's hard to imagine that this issue is going to have any less salience going forward than it does today for the Democratic Party. And that is very problematic for the Democratic Party.
I totally agree. I would argue that it would probably have more salience based on what we're seeing happening here at home.
It's hard to imagine it won't.
Yeah, the reality is, like, Palestine is, for better or worse, it's the cutting edge issue for American politics today, and not just because of what's happening overseas and what we're allowing to happen. The fact that Trump is now sending billions of dollars more in weapons through emergency orders to the Israeli government, despite there being like a supposed ceasefire. Like the reality of what's happening here at home to American citizens, to legal permanent residents, for speaking out, speaking about their own political perspectives on the issue, on what they believe is just unacceptable for our country, our institutions to be investing in. And to see the type of repression reverberate from the president himself, from the federal government, to see ICE at an individual's doorsteps who is here legally and has not violated any laws, as confirmed by the White House themselves just a couple of days ago. Like, this is an issue that affects every single American, whether or not you believe in Palestinian rights and the humanity of Palestinians. And if you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in American civil liberties, you have to recognize that this is an issue that affects all of us. And if you think that it's just about Palestine now, you're sorely mistaken. It's going to come for every single one of us. This is how authoritarianism works. This is how fascism starts. And unfortunately, that's where we are today.
I don't think it's a coincidence that they chose a permanent resident. This is a green card holder, married to an American with a child on the way. I mean, if there was almost any other profile other than this guy was promoting a free Palestine, it would be a much more cut and dry case in terms of like where the Democratic Party lines up on this, where the media lines up on this. I mean, this was in my estimation, a deliberate move by the Trump administration to find the sort of wedge issue within the context of where Democrats writ large are, their leadership is, and the media is, and to build this project of being able to expand their ability to deport people, arrest people. I mean, I don't know if you could say he's arrested because he hasn't been even, as far as I know, charged with a crime. He's just being detained in some way. And I don't know if we have another example of something like this. I don't ever recall a similar example of this type of like vague detention for someone based upon having protests that are aligned in some way. I'm not even sure what that word means. I mean, what has been your perspective on the response by Democratic lawmakers? I have a letter that was sent by, I think it was basically a dozen Congress people. And then I have another letter that was sent by AOC, Democratic lawmakers in New York State. But then you have other ones where Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer spend about 45 minutes of a letter basically saying, defending Israel.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that there is not a united front to protect, the First Amendment, to protect the Constitution. I don't think it should be controversial. Democrat, Republican, anyone, if you're elected to higher office, it should be innate that you defend the Constitution and every individual's freedoms that are protected by that document. That should be a non-starter. And so I don't want to just blame Democrats here. I think Republicans' silence in the face of Trump's increasing authoritarian effort here is really concerning. Republicans need to be standing out as well. But the fact that Democrats as an opposition party can't even, in a unified voice, take a step and say, it does not matter, this is unacceptable, this is unconstitutional, this is un-American, that's concerning. And the fact that you have leaders of, the Senate congressional delegation, the House Majority Leader, effectively engaging in anti-Palestinian rhetoric prior to just defending the First Amendment, that's really concerning. That does not bode well for where we are as Americans. And I hope things change. We do have a lot of leaders who have been very vocal and have not qualified, their defense of the Constitution. I think Senator Chris Murphy was very, very direct. I think there's a lot of hope there. And I think that a lot of members of Congress can take cues from some of those leaders.
We're going to play that clip a little later in the program. So what is, before we pivot to what's happening at the DOE, the objective of a new policy, the organization that you have started with Josh Paul, what is tactically, strategically, what are the objectives? Because it seems like, I mean, I know if it's a nonpartisan organization, but the Democratic Party seems to be the lowest of hanging fruit in terms of like change, but it really is. They're really boxed in, those leaders. It seems to me that some of these elected leaders are really boxed in. And at one point they've got to decide, we're not going to allow AIPAC and DMFI with basically Republican money to come and start to dictate where the direction of the party is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, frankly, the DNC has a responsibility to prevent that type of money from entering their primaries, because that is largely where the biggest impact has been in recent elections. And we've seen Democrats get primaried from the right, from a exclusively pro-Israel stance, and often minority Democrats, Democrats who are Black, who are getting primaried because of their position on human rights for Palestinians. And you're right. I think what we are doing with a new policy is recognizing that there are political barriers that just exist that should not be there. We need American politicians to work for the American people. And the reality is that our current policies of unconditional support to the Israeli government as it commits war crimes, as it withholds humanitarian aid, as it cuts off electricity, that's not good for people in the region, of course, but it's bad for American global standing. It's bad for American national security in the near and long term. And it's bad for Americans here at home who are watching billions of dollars go to another country's military instead of getting invested here at home as we're suffering because of rising costs due to inflation, because of corporate greed. There's no effort by Donald Trump and his administration to actually address the real problems that Americans are facing. And I think what we are trying to communicate is his willingness to allow AIPAC to write his talking points ultimately undermines American credibility and his credibility as a president who purportedly cares about the interests of everyday Americans. You don't get to say, oh, we are cutting off investments in other countries and all these like programs and aid except for Israel. Like that is really what he is doing. He is fast tracking billions of dollars of 2,000-pound bombs instead of just making sure that Americans here at home are feeling less pain because of the natural disasters that they've experienced over the last 6 months. That's not American. It's not good for anyone.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.